lives that passed across many times, most famously at Queensbury, 95 of 1875. Oh, 1895.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Edward Henry Carson. Ned to my family and friends. My father, also Edward Henry Carson, was an architect. My mother, Isabella, was a Lambert from County Galway, a descendant of the Cromwellian general, honest John Lambert. She was my first instructor in faith. Faith both in God and in the Union. It speaks volumes for her when I say that in my life I have seen much to shake my faith. But what remains is what I learned at my mother's knee. We lived on Harcourt Street in Dublin, and as a child, when I wasn't playing in St. Stephen's Green, I loved to draw, like my father. Nevertheless, he decided early on, for reasons known only to himself, that I should pursue a career as a barrister. I was never what you would call a gifted student, but rather ground out results by tenacity and plain hard work. I sat the entrance examination for Trinity College Dublin, along with a certain Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde. He grew up not far from me on Merrion Square. His father was a celebrated eye surgeon, his mother a poet. We were not complete strangers to each other, having sometimes played together as children, but we were never what you would call friends. Now, at Trinity, Wilde was admittedly a brilliant student, but, in my opinion, a conceited and generally dislikable young man. He eventually left for Oxford in a blaze of academic glory. Many years later, our paths quite literally crossed again. By that time, I was a Queen's Counsel and Liberal Unionist MP at Westminster. I was crossing the Strand in London one day when a fine carriage drawn by two horses almost knocked me down. The carriage stopped, and who should alight damply from it? Only Mr. Oscar Wilde. Then at the height of his fame and literary prowess. He was quite affable, and we shook hands. He invited me to come over for dinner to his house in Tite Street sometime, and we left it at that. Had I actually accepted his invitation, who knows what may have transpired, for I have a rule never to appear against anyone from whom I have accepted hospitality. The thing is, Wilde had become involved with Lord Alfred Douglas Taylor, the son of the Marquess of Queensbury, while the young man was an undergraduate at Oxford. Queensbury, who I have to say was a brute of a man, had heard rumours of a homosexual relationship between Wilde and his son, and had also had sight of one of Wilde's love letters to Bosie, as Wilde referred to the young Lord Alfred Douglas. Understandably furious, Queensbury publicly hounded Wilde, even attempting to disrupt the opening night of Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest at St. James's Theatre. He eventually brought matters to a head by leaving a card at Wilde's club, on the back of which he had written, in badly spelled English, to Oscar Wilde, posing as a sodomite. Wilde consulted his solicitor, who naturally inquired of his client if there was any truth to the allegation. Assuring him that there was not, Wilde in many ways contributed to his own downfall with that initial lie, which he subsequently repeated to his barrister, Sir Edward Clarke, QC. He was, unfortunately for him, advised to proceed, and, egged on by Bosie, who had no qualms about using him to further his own agenda against his estranged father, Wilde decided to proceed with a prosecution against the Marquis of Queensberry on a charge of criminal libel. It was, in my considered opinion, an ill-advised act of extreme folly on his part. I was approached by Queensberry's solicitor to defend him in the forthcoming trial. I must admit, I was initially hesitant to take the brief. After all, Wilde was a fellow Trinity man, and evidence against him seemed rather scant. Also, to be perfectly honest, I found the whole matter really quite distasteful. However, a private detective had been employed who managed to dig up further evidence against Wilde in the shape of a young man named Taylor, who was best described as, to be perfectly blunt, a pimp. His rooms, which Wilde was alleged to have frequented, were at the centre of a large homosexual circle, comprised mainly of young men from working class backgrounds. Queensberry's solicitor felt certain that these young men could be persuaded to give evidence incriminating Wilde. I was still hesitant in taking the brief, but eventually I decided to accept. The Old Bailey was packed when the trial opened on the 3rd of April 1895 before Mr. Justice Hen Collins, a fellow Irishman and Trinity graduate. Sir Edward Clarke, QC, opened for the prosecution. He was one of the most outstanding barristers of the day, and his performance that morning did not disappoint, for I never heard anything equal to it in all my life. Wilde exuded confidence on the stand, and answered his counsel's questions briefly and self-assuredly. However, he gave his age as 39, which I knew to be untrue. When I rose to begin my cross-examination, our eyes met for a moment. Was it my imagination? Or for just one fleeting instant did I see in his eyes the briefest flicker of fear? In any case, the moment passed, and Wilde regained his equilibrium, treating me to a condescending sneer. He had no doubt cast his mind back to our Trinity days, and reminded himself that he was only up against plodding old Ned Carson after all, who couldn't possibly be any match for the gleaming daggers of Wilde's consummate wit. Could he? I began my cross-examination by exposing Wilde's lie about his age. I could see this annoyed him somewhat, but he quickly regained the initiative, his witty ripostes to my questions often precipitating gales of laughter from the packed courtroom. I stuck grimly and tenaciously to my task, however, and old Ned Carson, the plugger, gradually began to grind Wilde back. He began to lose his composure, that I dropped the bombshell, announcing my intention to call each of the young men that Wilde had been involved with to give evidence against him. I was approached a short while later by Wilde's counsel, who instructed me that his client had now instructed him to withdraw the prosecution. The jury returned a verdict not guilty, and Queensberry was acquitted. For me, it was over. I had won. But you may believe me, or not, when I assure you that I took no pleasure in it. I discharged my legal and professional obligations to the best of my ability, as I always do. No more, no less. Wilde was arrested a short while later at the Keating Hotel and charged with gross indecency. I am happy to say that I took no part in any further proceedings against Mr. Wilde, save to approach the Solicitor General on his behalf. He was to prosecute Wilde in a second set of proceedings after the jury had failed to agree a verdict in the first. Cannot you let upon the fellow now? I asked him. He has suffered a great deal. But alas, it was not to be. Wilde was eventually convicted and handed the maximum sentence possible. 2 years imprisonment with hard labour. He was released from Reading Jail in May 1897 in every sense a ruined man. Our paths were to cross one final time before Wilde's untimely death in 1900, penniless and alone. I was visiting Paris and walking down the Boulevard Haussmann one day when I accidentally bumped into a fellow knocking him into the gut. I turned around, apologizing profusely, when I realized that the poor wretch whom I had knocked down was none other than the painted, gibbering wreck of a man whom I had once known to be Oscar Bingle of Flattery.